Most adults over 40 have felt it. That particular weight settling around the midsection, a density that didn't exist before, a heaviness that sits differently than weight used to. You notice it when you lean forward, when you try to button pants that fit last year, when you catch your reflection at an unexpected angle. It's not just the number on the scale. Something has changed in how your body stores itself. You already know something is wrong. You don't need a doctor to tell you that. Your embodied knowledge, the sensation in your own skin, recognizes this before any clinical marker confirms it. That recognition, that intuition about your own body, is exactly where we're starting. Because what you're sensing is real, and it's biochemically different from the weight you might have gained at 30. The fat accumulating around your organs, compressed and visceral, is not the same as the soft, subcutaneous tissue beneath the skin of your arms or thighs. This distinction matters profoundly at a biochemical level. Visceral adipose tissue, the fat wrapped around your liver, pancreas, and intestines, is metabolically hyperactive. It's not inert storage. It's an endocrine organ, constantly secreting hormones and inflammatory molecules that circulate directly to your liver through the portal blood system. Your body is speaking to you through this accumulation, telling you something about how your stress systems have adapted and shifted over the decades. By your 40s, you've accumulated something invisible yet powerful. Years of chronic stress. Not acute crisis, but the relentless low-grade tension of modern life. Tight shoulders during meetings, racing thoughts at 3 in the morning, the constant low hum of alert that never quite switches off. Your nervous system has learned to live in a state of readiness, and your hormones have adapted accordingly. This is where the story truly begins. Not with what you see, but with what's happening beneath the surface. At the core of this adaptation is a system you've probably never consciously thought about. Your HPA axis. The initials stand for hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal cortex, 3 small endocrine structures that form a communication network as fundamental to survival as your heartbeat. When your brain perceives threat, real or imagined, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called CRH. This triggers the pituitary gland to release ACTH. ACTH then stimulates your adrenal cortex to produce cortisol, the stress hormone that sharpens your focus, mobilizes glucose, and prepares your body for action. This system evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to keep you alive during acute danger. But you're not facing acute danger. You're facing bills, emails, deadlines, traffic, uncertainty about the future. Stimuli that your ancient nervous system interprets as ongoing threat. The HPA axis, designed for sprints, is now running a marathon. And by 40, something has shifted in how this system responds. Cortisol, the central hormone of your stress response, is not inherently your enemy. You need cortisol. It's essential for waking up, for mobilizing energy, for thinking clearly. The problem emerges when cortisol stays elevated, when the normal rhythm of this hormone flattens or inverts. When your cortisol should be declining through the afternoon and evening, preparing you for sleep. Instead, it remains stubbornly high. This is called HPA dysregulation. Not a disease diagnosis, but a measurable shift in how your brain, pituitary, and adrenal system communicate. And this dysregulation has a specific consequence. It preferentially drives fat storage in your visceral compartment. This is the promise of understanding the mechanism. Unlike generic weight loss advice, eat less, move more, willpower harder, this video will explain precisely why your body is storing fat in this particular way. Why the protocol works because it addresses the root cause, not just the symptom. Why your body at 40 responds to a different set of rules than it did at 25. Every protocol presented on this channel is reviewed by a clinical pharmacist and researcher. We don't offer speculation or trends. We offer mechanism, evidence, and the deep understanding that transforms knowledge into lasting change. Before we continue deeper into how your stress system shapes your body's chemistry, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your perspective matters here. This conversation is global, and we want to know who's listening. Deep within your brain, in a structure no larger than an almond, lies the hypothalamus. For decades, it has been processing every signal of threat, every moment of uncertainty, every stimulus that suggests you need to be ready. This tiny cluster of neurons doesn't distinguish between a predator and a performance review. It responds the same way. Activate. When the hypothalamus perceives stress, it releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, a molecular messenger that travels through tiny blood vessels to the pituitary gland, nestled at the base of your skull. The pituitary, often called the master gland of your endocrine system, receives this signal and responds by releasing adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This hormone courses through your bloodstream until it reaches your adrenal glands, small triangular structures perched atop your kidneys. The adrenal cortex, the outer layer of these glands, then produces cortisol, the hormone that initiates your entire stress response. This feedback loop, this three-part conversation between your brain and your body, is exquisitely sensitive. It's designed to activate quickly and shut down just as fast. When cortisol levels rise sufficiently, negative feedback signals should tell your hypothalamus and pituitary to dial back their production. This is the system's natural braking mechanism. But in adults over 40, something fundamental shifts. Years of accumulated stress, not catastrophic moments, but the relentless undertone of modern existence, begins to alter this delicate communication. The hypothalamus becomes more sensitive to perceived threats. The pituitary becomes more responsive. The adrenal glands, which have been working overtime for years, begin to shift their baseline operation. This is HPA dysregulation, and it's not a sudden breakdown. It's a gradual recalibration of your stress system toward a new elevated set point. Imagine a thermostat that was designed to maintain 68 degrees, but over years of constant adjustments, its baseline drifts toward 75. The system still functions. It's not broken, but it's now operating at a higher threshold. Your HPA axis has learned that the world demands constant vigilance. The diurnal cortisol curve, that beautiful rhythm where cortisol peaks at dawn and declines through the day, begins to flatten. Some people develop inverted patterns, where cortisol remains stubbornly elevated in the evening when it should be declining. Others wake without the normal cortisol surge that provides energy and mental clarity. What makes this particularly relevant to what you're experiencing in your midsection is that dysregulation doesn't simply increase cortisol everywhere in your body. It increases cortisol's effects precisely where visceral adipose tissue resides. Visceral fat cells are exquisitely sensitive to cortisol because they express abundantly the receptors that cortisol binds to. These receptors, called glucocorticoid receptors, are distributed throughout your body, but visceral adipose tissue, the fat around your organs, has a far higher density of these receptors than subcutaneous fat. This is a crucial detail. Your belly doesn't accumulate fat because you've eaten more or moved less. It accumulates fat because your stress system is constantly signaling that it's time to store energy in your visceral compartment. The chronic elevation of cortisol that accompanies HPA dysregulation has another insidious effect. Prolonged exposure to elevated cortisol paradoxically increases the number of glucocorticoid receptors in visceral adipose tissue. Your body is essentially becoming more responsive to cortisol's fat storage signal. It's not just that your stress hormones are elevated. Your tissue is becoming increasingly sensitized to listen to those signals. This is how a dysregulated stress system becomes a literal blueprint for visceral fat accumulation. Your body is working exactly as designed. It's responding to what it perceives as chronic threat by storing energy in the metabolically active visceral compartment, positioning that energy for immediate mobilization. This also explains why visceral fat is so resistant to typical interventions. You can't exercise your way out of a dysregulated HPA axis. You can't willpower restrict your way past a stress system that's been conditioned over decades to maintain elevated cortisol. The problem isn't in your discipline or your metabolism's basic function. The problem is in the conversation between your brain and your body. A conversation that has been shaped by years of accumulated stress and has literally rewired how your stress hormones talk to your visceral fat cells. Understanding this mechanism is the first step toward interrupting it. The protocol works because it addresses these exact points of dysregulation, not by fighting your body's stress system, but by helping it remember its natural rhythm and sensitivity. I understand the requirements completely. I'm writing. Part 3 of a 7-part documentary about visceral fat and cortisol dysregulation. Targeting. 714 words. In pure English narrative prose, continuing directly from where Part 2 ended. Let me write Part 3 now, maintaining continuity and following the outline section on glucocorticoid receptors. Now we arrive at a distinction that fundamentally explains why your body responds to cortisol the way it does. Cortisol doesn't simply float through your bloodstream like a message in a bottle, hoping to be found. It must bind to specific receptors, molecular locks that only cortisol can open. These are glucocorticoid receptors, or GRs, and they exist in nearly every cell in your body. But here's the critical detail. They are not distributed equally. Your visceral adipose tissue, the fat surrounding your organs, the fat you feel hardening around your midsection, expresses significantly more glucocorticoid receptors than the subcutaneous fat beneath your skin. This asymmetry is not an accident, it's evolutionary architecture. When your brain perceives threat, it releases cortisol specifically to mobilize stored energy. Throughout evolutionary history, that energy needed to be accessible quickly, and the most metabolically active fat deposits were always the visceral ones. Visceral adipose tissue has a rich blood supply and direct access to your liver through the portal circulation. It's positioned to respond immediately to hormonal signals. So your visceral fat cells evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to cortisol. They developed more glucocorticoid receptors than any other fat depot in your body. In a young person with a calm nervous system, this system works perfectly. Occasional cortisol spikes mobilize energy, and the system quickly returns to baseline. But in someone with chronic HPA dysregulation, someone over 40 who has accumulated years of relentless stress, something devastating happens. The prolonged elevation of cortisol doesn't just signal your visceral fat cells to store energy, it actually causes them to upregulate. They develop even more glucocorticoid receptors. Your visceral adipocytes are becoming increasingly sensitized to listen to cortisol's message, and that message, under conditions of dysregulation, is store fat here, store it now, store it continuously. This upregulation is measurable. Researchers have found that in people with chronic visceral obesity, the density of glucocorticoid receptors in visceral adipose tissue is elevated compared to lean controls. Your body isn't broken. It's responding with perfect logic to what it perceives as a permanent state of threat. It's saying, we must maintain energy reserves because survival is uncertain. The visceral compartment, being the most metabolically active and immediately accessible, becomes the primary storage site. The consequence is that cortisol doesn't just increase overall fat storage, it preferentially directs energy accumulation to your visceral compartment. This is why two people can gain the same amount of weight while experiencing completely different body composition changes. One person, with a regulated HPA axis and normal glucocorticoid receptor distribution, might gain weight proportionally across their body. Another person, with dysregulation and upregulated GR density in visceral tissue, will accumulate fat, predominantly in the belly. The difference isn't in calories or exercise. It's in the hormonal signal that's being sent and the tissue's heightened sensitivity to receive that signal. Your age accelerates this process. As you move through your 40s and 50s, your glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity and distribution naturally shift. The peak sensitivity of visceral adipose tissue to cortisol typically occurs in midlife. Simultaneously, the mechanisms that would normally downregulate GR expression become less efficient. Your body is simultaneously becoming more responsive to cortisol while losing some of its ability to dial back that responsiveness. It's a double vulnerability, and it explains why so many people experience a sudden shift in fat distribution after 40. Your body isn't betraying you. It's aging in a way that amplifies cortisol's fat storage signal. This is also why visceral fat is so resistant to typical interventions. The problem isn't in your willpower or your metabolism's basic machinery. The problem is in the conversation between your stress hormones and your visceral fat cells. Cortisol is speaking to tissue that has been conditioned to listen with extraordinary sensitivity. You can't exercise away a receptor density problem. You can't restrict calories past a hormonal signal that's telling your cells to prioritize energy storage. The protocol works because it addresses this exact mechanism. By restoring normal cortisol regulation, you reduce the signal. And by reducing the signal over weeks and months, your visceral adipocytes gradually downregulate their glucocorticoid receptors, becoming less sensitized to cortisol's command. Your body is not your enemy. It's responding to information it's been receiving for years. Now we shift our focus from the receptors themselves to what they actually do, the biochemical process that transforms a hormonal signal into stored fat. This process is called lipogenesis, and it is far more than a passive accumulation. It is an active enzyme-driven manufacturing operation that your body initiates in response to cortisol's command. Lipogenesis is the synthesis of triglycerides, the storage form of fat, from simpler molecules like glucose and amino acids. Your cells have dedicated enzymatic machinery for this process, and cortisol acts as a master switch that turns this machinery on, especially in visceral adipocytes. When cortisol binds to glucocorticoid receptors in your visceral fat cells, it activates a cascade of transcription factors that upregulate two critical enzymes, acetyl-CoA carboxylase and fatty acid synthase. These enzymes catalyze the conversion of glucose into fatty acids, which are then packaged into triglycerides and stored. Cortisol isn't simply telling your body to store energy. It's upregulating the factories that manufacture stored fat. But cortisol's role in visceral fat accumulation doesn't end there. It simultaneously orchestrates another process that makes the situation worse. Cortisol increases insulin resistance, a shift in how your cells respond to the hormone insulin. Chronically elevated cortisol impairs insulin signaling in muscle and fat tissue, while simultaneously suppressing insulin sensitivity in the brain, creating a metabolic environment where your pancreas must secrete more insulin to achieve the same glucose-lowering effect. Higher insulin levels, in turn, amplify lipogenesis even further. Insulin and cortisol together are a potent signal for fat storage, and they work synergistically in visceral adipose tissue, which is exquisitely sensitive to both hormones. There is a second blade to this double blow, and it is equally important. While cortisol is promoting the synthesis and storage of fat, it is simultaneously suppressing the breakdown of stored fat, a process called lipolysis. This suppression occurs through cortisol's inhibition of hormone-sensitive lipase, the enzyme responsible for breaking down triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol that can be mobilized for energy. Under conditions of dysregulated cortisol, your visceral adipocytes are simultaneously receiving maximum signals to build fat and minimum signals to break it down. You are trapped in a one-way metabolic door. Energy flows in and is stored, but cannot easily flow out. This dual mechanism, increased lipogenesis coupled with suppressed lipolysis, is amplified precisely in visceral adipose tissue because of the glucocorticoid receptor density we discussed earlier. Visceral fat cells receive cortisol's signal with crystal clarity. They build fat aggressively and resist fat mobilization stubbornly. Over months and years, this becomes visibly apparent as the hardening and thickening around your midsection that resists typical weight loss efforts. The consequences extend beyond visceral fat itself. Cortisol-driven lipogenesis doesn't stop at your abdominal cavity. Elevated cortisol also drives ectopic fat deposition, fat storage in tissues where it shouldn't accumulate, particularly in the liver. Hepatic steatosis, or fatty liver disease, develops when triglycerides accumulate in hepatocytes. This is not merely a cosmetic or local problem. Fatty liver is directly linked to worsening insulin resistance, which creates a vicious feedback loop. More insulin resistance amplifies cortisol's effect on lipogenesis, which deepens hepatic steatosis, which further impairs insulin signaling. The liver, being metabolically central to your entire body, becomes a nexus of dysfunction. Its ability to regulate glucose output, to process lipids, to synthesize proteins, all are compromised when fat infiltrates its cells. This is why the protocol specifically targets cortisol dysregulation rather than attacking fat storage through dietary restriction alone. You cannot willpower restrict your way out of a lipogenic signal that's being sent continuously from your brain to your visceral and hepatic fat depots. The factories manufacturing fat are running at full capacity. Reducing calories might create a caloric deficit, but it won't shut down the enzymatic machinery that cortisol has activated. It won't restore the lipolytic capacity that cortisol has suppressed. It won't normalize insulin signaling that cortisol has compromised. By restoring normal cortisol regulation, the protocol addresses the root signal. Acetyl-CoA carboxylase and fatty acid synthase expression decline. Hormone-sensitive lipase is released from suppression. Insulin sensitivity begins to normalize. The one-way metabolic door swings open in both directions again. Fat can be stored when appropriate and mobilized when needed. Your liver gradually sheds its excess triglyceride burden. This is metabolic healing, not caloric restriction. Your body's chemistry is working exactly as it has been instructed to work. The inflammatory cascade that emerges from chronic visceral fat accumulation represents a fundamental shift in how your body communicates with itself. Visceral adipose tissue is not inert storage. It is an endocrine organ, actively secreting molecules that reshape your metabolic destiny. Unlike subcutaneous fat, which sits passively beneath your skin, visceral fat wraps around your organs and dumps its chemical messages directly into your portal circulation, the blood vessels that flow first to your liver before dispersing throughout your body. When visceral adipocytes become enlarged and chronically stimulated by cortisol, they begin secreting pro-inflammatory cytokines at elevated levels. Interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha pour into your bloodstream with increasing concentration. These molecules are not minor signaling players. They are orchestrators of systemic dysfunction. Your liver, receiving this inflammatory signal first and most potently, responds by becoming insulin resistant. Hepatocytes lose their sensitivity to insulin's normal regulatory commands, which means your pancreas must work harder, secreting more insulin to achieve the same glucose-lowering effect. The result is hyperinsulinemia, chronically elevated insulin levels circulating throughout your bloodstream. This creates a vicious cycle that most people never recognize. Higher insulin levels amplify the cortisol-driven lipogenesis we discussed earlier. Insulin and cortisol together act synergistically in visceral adipocytes, creating an extraordinarily potent signal for energy storage. The visceral fat accumulates faster. The inflammatory signal grows stronger. Your liver becomes increasingly fatty, and the insulin resistance deepens further. You are caught in a self-perpetuating loop, where each turn of the cycle worsens the conditions that sustain it. Over weeks and months, this localized inflammatory signal doesn't remain confined to your gut. It spreads systemically. Markers of chronic inflammation, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, fibrinogen, inflammatory cytokine profiles begin to rise throughout your bloodstream. Your immune system enters a state of chronic low-grade activation. This is not acute inflammation, the kind your body deploys to fight infection or heal injury. This is systemic inflammation, a smoldering fire that damages tissue slowly and invisibly. It affects your blood vessel endothelium, promoting atherosclerosis. It infiltrates your joints, contributing to arthritic degeneration. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, affecting neuroinflammation and cognitive function. By your middle 40s, many people experience this shift as a vague sense that their body has become more fragile, more prone to aches, more susceptible to illness. At the cellular level, something equally insidious is occurring. Chronic inflammation and elevated cortisol impair the dynamics of mitochondrial fusion and fission, the processes by which mitochondria combine and divide to maintain optimal function and energy production. Your mitochondria become fragmented. ATP production declines. The energy currency of your cells becomes scarce. This energy deficit is particularly devastating in metabolically demanding tissues. Your brain, your heart, your muscles. Your nervous system senses this energy scarcity and interprets it as a threat. In response, it activates your HPA axis again. Cortisol rises, and now you have another vicious loop. Inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction trigger HPA activation, which releases more cortisol, which deepens inflammation and further fragments your mitochondria. This is why people with visceral obesity and HPA dysregulation so often report chronic fatigue, afternoon energy crashes, and difficulty sustaining mental focus. The fatigue is real. It reflects genuine mitochondrial dysfunction, not laziness or insufficient willpower. Your cells are literally running low on energy. There is one more critical pathway that closes the inflammatory loop: The chronic inflammation weakens your intestinal barrier, the tight junctions between enterocytes that normally prevent unwanted molecules from crossing into your bloodstream. This breakdown is called increased intestinal permeability, colloquially, leaky gut. Bacterial lipopolysaccharide, or LPS, begins to translocate across the compromised barrier and enters your circulation. LPS is a potent immune activator. It binds to toll-like receptors on immune cells and triggers inflammatory cytokine release. This further amplifies systemic inflammation and simultaneously reactivates your HPA axis. Perceived immune threat signals CRH release from your hypothalamus. Your body perceives itself under siege. What started as cortisol-driven visceral fat accumulation has evolved into a state of systemic inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, intestinal permeability, and HPA hyperactivation. These are not separate problems. They are interconnected nodes in a single network of dysfunction. This is why addressing only one node, restricting calories, exercising harder, taking a supplement, fails to resolve the core issue. The protocol works because it interrupts multiple points simultaneously, allowing the entire network to begin healing. Part 6. The Longevity Protocol. Mechanistic justification for every step understanding the cascade of visceral fat accumulation, inflammatory signaling, and HPA dysregulation is valuable only if it leads somewhere, to intervention, to healing, to genuine change. This is where mechanism meets application. Every component of the protocol you are about to learn addresses a specific node in the network of dysfunction. Nothing is arbitrary. Nothing is based on trend or intuition. Each intervention targets measurable physiological disruption with precision. Begin with phosphatidylserine, an 800 mg daily dose divided into 2 portions, with the evening administration timed deliberately. Phosphatidylserine functions as a signaling molecule that enhances the negative feedback loop when both cortisol and ACTH are elevated. Your pituitary gland, when it detects rising cortisol in the bloodstream, should receive increasingly powerful signals to suppress ACTH release. Chronic stress has weakened this feedback mechanism. The signal has become muted. Phosphatidylserine restores sensitivity. The evening dose is critical because it must blunt the morning cortisol surge, that dawn rise that should gently wake your nervous system, but instead, in dysregulated individuals, jolts you into sympathetic activation before your feet touch the ground. Ashwagandha, specifically the KSM-66 standardized extract at 600 mg daily, operates through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. The withanolide compounds standardized into this particular extract enhance GABA-like modulation at the neurological level, while exerting direct suppression of the HPA axis itself. Multiple randomized controlled trials in adults over 40 demonstrate cortisol reduction paired with significant visceral fat loss, without the catastrophic suppression of necessary cortisol that would impair your ability to respond to genuine threats. The KSM-66 specification matters profoundly. Lesser extracts lack this potency and consistency. Many of you recognize ashwagandha intuitively. This science validates your intuition, while deepening it beyond folk remedy into mechanistic precision. Magnesium glycinate, 400 to 500 mg taken in the evening, addresses the physiological substrate of stress itself. Magnesium is a natural agonist at GABA-A receptors. GABA directly inhibits corticotropin-releasing hormone release from your hypothalamus. The glycinate form provides superior bioavailability compared to other magnesium compounds, and it carries additional neurological benefits through its own independent GABA-enhancing properties. At the transcriptional level, magnesium inhibits the glucocorticoid response elements that cortisol uses to activate gene expression in visceral adipocytes. You are essentially removing the molecular tools cortisol requires to build visceral fat. Sleep prioritization stands outside the supplement category entirely, yet it is non-negotiable. During deep sleep, your HPA axis undergoes restoration. The negative feedback mechanisms that have been blunted by chronic stress gradually retrain themselves. Your cortisol rhythm, flattened by years of dysregulation, begins to steepen again. No supplement overcomes the physiological damage of chronic sleep deprivation. Sleep is where healing originates. Most adults over 40 in industrialized societies are chronically sleep deprived without recognizing it as such. They have simply forgotten what 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep feels like. Parasympathetic activation practices, deliberate breathwork, vagal tone exercises, practices that stimulate your vagus nerve directly, interrupt the constant low-level sympathetic vigilance that keeps your HPA axis chronically activated. Vagal afferent signaling inhibits CRH release and simultaneously promotes GABA synthesis throughout your nervous system. You will feel this shift in nervous system tone before you see metabolic changes. Your nervous system will signal to your body that threat has diminished. Only then will your body begin to release its defensive posture. Finally, insulin optimization through low glycemic eating patterns and intermittent fasting, when individually tolerated, reduces postprandial hyperinsulinemia, the blood sugar spikes and insulin surges that follow meals. This synergizes powerfully with cortisol reduction, because these two hormones act as metabolic partners. Lowering insulin amplifies the effect of cortisol normalization. Together, they restore the metabolic flexibility your body possessed before dysregulation set in. Your cells can access stored energy when fasted. They can accept incoming energy when fed. The one-directional metabolic trap dissolves. Every element of this protocol interconnects. Remove one component, and the others function less effectively. Apply all simultaneously, and you create systemic momentum toward healing. This is not symptom suppression. This is network restoration. Integration and longevity. From mechanism to lived experience. The timeline matters profoundly here. Cortisol dysregulation does not develop overnight. It accumulates across years of chronic stress, inflammatory dietary patterns, fragmented sleep, and the particular vulnerabilities that arrive with middle age. Your body did not betray you in weeks. It responded predictably to years of sustained threat signals. Reversal, therefore, requires patience calibrated to this reality. Expect measurable changes in visceral fat reduction within 8 to 12 weeks of consistent protocol adherence. This is not a rapid metabolic reset. This is retraining of the HPA axis itself, a fundamental recalibration of how your brain, pituitary, and adrenal cortex communicate. Genuine systemic healing moves at the pace of physiological adaptation, not the pace of social media promises. What changes first, however, often surprises people. Sleep quality transforms before your waistline does. You will notice deeper, more restorative sleep within 2 to 3 weeks. Your stress resilience shifts noticeably. Situations that previously triggered afternoon anxiety or evening rumination lose their grip on your nervous system. Mental clarity emerges. That particular fog that had become so normalized, you stopped recognizing it as fog. These early changes signal that the HPA axis is beginning to downregulate, that your nervous system is receiving credible signals of safety. Track these internal shifts carefully. They are the neurobiological foundation upon which metabolic healing builds. Visceral fat reduction itself becomes measurable through waist circumference tracking, specifically at the level of your navel, where visceral adipose tissue concentrates most densely. Waist circumference matters far more than total body weight, because you are losing metabolically active inflammatory tissue, not merely water or muscle. Your fasting glucose improves. Liver enzymes, ALT and GGT, decline as hepatic steatosis reverses. These are not cosmetic changes. These are reversals of metabolic damage. Secondary health gains compound as visceral fat decreases. Inflammatory markers in your bloodstream, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, decline measurably. Your cardiovascular risk profile shifts favorably. Every kilogram of visceral fat you lose translates directly into reduced mortality risk according to large prospective cohort studies following thousands of individuals across decades. You are not merely looking better. You are aging more slowly at the cellular level. Your future is literally being extended. Mitochondrial recovery unfolds gradually, then suddenly. For months, you notice steady improvement in energy production. The chronic fatigue that felt permanent begins to lift. Afternoon crashes that you had adapted your entire life around, the 3 o'clock exhaustion that drove you toward stimulants, the evening collapse that meant no energy for relationships or interests, these dissolve. Your cellular power plants, damaged by years of inflammation and cortisol excess, rebuild their cristae. ATP production stabilizes. You move through your days without the constant energy bankruptcy that had become your baseline. Gut barrier restoration occurs in parallel. As visceral fat shrinks and inflammatory signaling recedes, intestinal permeability normalizes. Tight junctions between enterocytes tighten. Bacterial lipopolysaccharide no longer freely translocates across a compromised barrier. Circulating LPS drops. Your immune system stops perceiving constant microbial threat. The vicious loop closes. The full network healing becomes visible when you step back and observe the entire system. HPA dysregulation decreases because cortisol is no longer elevated chronically. Visceral fat decreases because cortisol no longer preferentially drives lipogenesis into abdominal adipocytes. Inflammatory signaling decreases because visceral adipose tissue no longer floods your circulation with IL-6 and TNF-alpha. Your gut barrier tightens because intestinal inflammation has receded. Circulating LPS decreases because the barrier has healed. Your HPA axis finds a new, sustainable baseline. This is not symptomatic suppression of one problem. This is true systemic healing, the restoration of interconnected physiological networks to functional coherence. Beyond the protocol itself lies something more valuable: understanding. You now comprehend why chronic stress accumulates as belly fat specifically. You understand the mechanisms that drive metabolic dysfunction. You recognize that your body has not betrayed you. It has responded exactly as evolution designed it to respond to perceived chronic threat. This knowledge becomes your protection. Future stress will inevitably arise. Poor sleep will occasionally compromise your recovery. Inflammatory foods will tempt you. But you will recognize these as HPA axis activators, not moral failures. You will return to the protocol not from shame, but from mechanistic understanding. At 40, 50, 60, and beyond, your body is not broken. It is remarkably resilient, waiting for the signal that threat has diminished. The protocol provides that signal. Your visceral fat will decrease. Your inflammation will recede. Your energy will return. You do not have to live with the sense that your body has turned against you. You can reclaim metabolic resilience and the longevity that accompanies it.